I think it's time for her to move in with us.
I can manage just fine, Doctor.
Mrs. Davis, your son has a point. I take the medication as prescribed, and my vitals have improved steadily. That's incredible. Your adherence and results are outstanding. Oh, thank God. You answered everything.
Yes.
But you shouldn't have known that.
Why not?
No. I decide, not them.
The moment my own son looked my doctor in the eye and said, "She can't manage her own care anymore," something inside me went completely still. Dr. Melissa Carter turned toward me with quiet concern, as if I had already disappeared behind the word incapable. Before either of them could decide who I was, I answered every question she asked: my medications, my medical history, every appointment, every date, without missing a single detail. The color drained from Daniel Underwood's face. That's when I realized this appointment had never been about my health. It was about taking my life away one signature at a time. If this story touches your heart, I'd love for you to stay with me until the end. Please like this video if you believe growing older should never mean losing your dignity. Subscribe if you enjoy stories about resilience, justice, and second chances. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, what would you do if someone you trusted tried to convince the world you were no longer capable? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. People often assume that independence disappears quietly, like daylight fading into evening. They imagine it slips away so gradually that no one notices until it's already gone. But I learned something very different. Sometimes people try to steal your independence long before you've actually lost it. They simply hope everyone else believes you've already surrendered it. 8 years before that appointment with Dr. Melissa Carter, I buried my husband, Thomas Underwood. Even now, saying those words still tightens something inside my chest. Thomas had been a history teacher at Franklin Heights High School in Columbus, Ohio, for nearly 35 years. He loved telling stories about ordinary people who had quietly changed history through courage instead of fame. Whenever our grandson was younger, Thomas would joke that history wasn't made by kings. It was made by stubborn people who refused to quit. He was one of those stubborn people himself. Cancer finally took him after nearly 2 years of treatments. When people asked how I managed after losing him, I always smiled politely and answered the same way: one day at a time. The truth was far more complicated. For months after the funeral, every room in our house felt too large. I'd wake up expecting to hear Thomas grinding coffee beans downstairs before realizing the kitchen would stay silent. I thought loneliness would be the hardest part. Instead, it was learning how to continue living. Little by little, I rebuilt a routine. Every morning, I woke up at 6:30. I made my bed before breakfast, because Thomas always insisted a made bed made every difficult day feel slightly more organized. I watered the flowers he'd planted along the front porch. I walked exactly 2 miles through our neighborhood whenever the weather allowed. By 9 o'clock, I usually arrived at the Columbus Public Library, where I volunteered 3 mornings each week after retiring as a librarian myself. Books had always been my second family. Helping children discover reading reminded me that hope often arrived disguised as a simple story. Tuesday afternoons belonged to my church. Thursday mornings were grocery shopping. Friday evenings meant dinner with my closest friend, Grace Whitmore. Grace and I had lived across the street from each other for nearly 25 years. We'd raised children together, survived marriages, celebrated birthdays, comforted each other through funerals. She knew my life almost as well as I did. Whenever she teased me about color-coding my pantry shelves or alphabetizing the spice cabinet, I reminded her that organization wasn't an obsession. It was simply efficient. Thomas used to laugh whenever we had that argument. You two will still be debating cinnamon placement when you're 90. After Thomas died, I continued managing every part of our life exactly as we always had. Every bill was paid before its due date. Every medical appointment went into my calendar. Every prescription refill was logged in a notebook I kept beside the refrigerator. I balanced my checking account every Sunday evening. Not because I had to, because I liked knowing everything was in order. Some people collect antiques. Others collect recipes. Apparently, I collected well-labeled folders. Thomas appreciated that. He always said I could locate any document in our house faster than most attorneys. Our financial life had never been complicated. We owned our home outright. We carried no credit card debt. Our retirement accounts were comfortable without being extravagant. Thomas had planned carefully because he never wanted me worrying about money after he was gone. I can't protect you forever, he'd once told me while updating our estate documents, but I can make sure life stays manageable. He kept that promise. For nearly 8 years, I never missed a payment, never overdrew an account, never forgot a doctor's appointment, never misplaced an important document. Life wasn't exciting, but it was peaceful. Daniel often joked that I lived by spreadsheets. Maybe I did. He was 43 now, my only child. When he was young, he had been endlessly curious, always asking questions, always taking apart radios just to see how they worked. Thomas believed Daniel would become an engineer someday. Instead, he built a successful career as a financial advisor. Or at least that's what everyone believed. Back then, I certainly did. After Thomas passed away, Daniel visited almost every weekend. At first, those visits meant everything to me. He mowed the lawn, changed smoke detector batteries, cleaned the gutters, fixed a leaking kitchen faucet. He insisted I shouldn't climb ladders anymore. I appreciated that. Every son should worry about his mother climbing onto the roof. Looking back now, I realize something changed so gradually I barely noticed it. His help slowly expanded. One Saturday afternoon, he asked, "Mom, where do you keep your insurance policies just in case something ever happens?" It sounded reasonable. I showed him the filing cabinet in my home office. A month later, he asked where I kept my living trust, then where my property tax records were stored, then my Medicare paperwork, then my banking information. Each question arrived separately. Each sounded perfectly practical. I never felt pressured. I certainly never imagined danger. After all, he wasn't asking for ownership. He was asking where things were. Or so I believed. Eventually, he suggested making digital copies. "If there's ever a fire," he explained, "you'll be glad everything is backed up." I agreed. That sounded responsible. He scanned dozens of documents onto his laptop while I brewed coffee in the kitchen. I thanked him afterward. I even baked his favorite apple pie. Today, thinking about that afternoon still makes my stomach twist. Another change seemed harmless at the time. Daniel suggested becoming my emergency contact everywhere. Hospital records, insurance companies, the pharmacy. "It'll make things easier if anyone ever needs to reach family," he said. I couldn't argue with that. Thomas was gone. Daniel was my only child. Of course he should be listed first. I signed a few forms without much thought. Nothing transferred ownership. Nothing gave away my independence. Or so I believed. Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, always smiled warmly whenever they visited. She brought flowers, complimented my cooking, asked about church. She called me every Mother's Day without fail. If she noticed Daniel becoming increasingly involved in my paperwork, she never said anything. Neither did I. Sometimes she'd laugh and say, "Daniel worries too much." I'd smile. "He gets that from his father." She would nod. Looking back, I wonder if that smile hid something I couldn't yet see. Even Grace noticed Daniel's growing involvement. One evening over coffee, she casually asked, "Don't you think he's taking on an awful lot?" I shrugged. "He's trying to help." Grace stirred her coffee slowly. "I know." Then she looked at me for a long moment. "Just promise me one thing." "What?" "If something ever feels strange, even a little strange, don't ignore it because he's your son." I laughed. "Grace, you've watched too many crime shows." She laughed too. "I probably have." Neither of us realized how important that conversation would become. Months passed peacefully, or at least they appeared peaceful. Daniel continued stopping by every Saturday. He'd ask about my medications, offer to organize paperwork, remind me about appointments I already remembered perfectly well. Sometimes he'd repeat the same question twice. "Did you take your blood pressure medicine today?" "Yes." "You sure?" "Daniel, I've taken it every morning at 8 for 7 years." He'd smile apologetically. I'm only checking. Back then, I thought his concern came from love. Now I understand something painful. Real care helps someone remain independent. Control quietly teaches them to doubt themselves. At the time, however, I never questioned his intentions. Why would I? He was my son. And I believe the greatest blessing of growing older was knowing your children wanted to protect you. I had no idea that while I was trusting Daniel with small pieces of my life, he was quietly placing himself between me and nearly every important decision I would someday need to make. I also had no idea that the doctor's appointment waiting just ahead wasn't the beginning of his plan. It was simply the first moment I finally noticed it. The morning of my annual appointment began like dozens of others before it. I woke at 6:30 without an alarm, just as I had for years. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains in my bedroom, painting pale gold patterns across the hardwood floor Thomas had refinished himself nearly 20 years earlier. For a few peaceful minutes, nothing felt unusual. I made my bed, fed the pair of cardinals that visited the backyard every morning, watered the geraniums on the porch. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal blueberries and a cup of black coffee while reviewing my planner. At the top of the page, I'd written 3 reminders. 10:00 a.m. Annual appointment with Dr. Carter. Pick up blood pressure prescription afterward. Meet Grace for lunch at 1. Simple. Ordinary. Exactly the kind of day I liked. At 8:30, my phone rang. It was Daniel. Morning, Mom. Good morning. I'll pick you up around 9:15. You don't have to. I can drive myself. I know you can, he replied quickly. I was already heading that direction. It'll save you the trouble. I hesitated. I really don't mind driving. I insist. His tone remained pleasant, but there was something firm underneath it. I finally smiled. All right. Perfect. See you soon. When he arrived, Rebecca was in the passenger seat. She leaned across the console with her usual warm smile. Hi, Charlene. Hello, sweetheart. She hugged me gently before I climbed into the back seat. I hope we're not interrupting your morning. Not at all. The drive to Riverside Family Medical Center took about 20 minutes. Daniel kept making small talk. He asked about church, asked whether I'd finished the mystery novel I was reading, asked whether Grace's granddaughter had started college yet. Perfectly ordinary conversation. Looking back, I realize he was unusually cheerful, almost rehearsed. Inside the clinic, everything felt familiar. The receptionist recognized me immediately. Good morning, Mrs. Underwood. Good morning, Emily. She handed me a clipboard. Just the usual annual paperwork. I laughed. I think I've filled out these same forms for 10 years. Emily grinned. Probably true. I sat down and carefully completed every page. Current medications, emergency contact, insurance verification, medical history. Nothing had changed. When I finished, Daniel reached toward the clipboard. I'll take it up. I can do that. I've got it. Again, it seemed harmless. He handed the forms to Emily, while Rebecca quietly flipped through a magazine nearby. About 15 minutes later, a nurse called my name. Charlene Underwood. I stood. Daniel stood too. The nurse smiled politely. Family can come back if you'd like. I'd appreciate that, Daniel answered before I could speak. That surprised me slightly. Normally, my appointments lasted 15 minutes. There had never been any reason for him to come inside. Still, I didn't object. The nurse checked my blood pressure. 122/74, she smiled. Looks wonderful. Weight, pulse, temperature, everything looked normal. Then she asked my usual questions. Any recent falls? No. Dizziness? No. Changes in appetite? No. She entered everything into her tablet. A few minutes later, Dr. Melissa Carter walked in carrying my chart. She had been my physician for nearly 12 years. I trusted her. She greeted me warmly. It's good to see you again, Charlene. You too. She shook Daniel's hand. Hello. Daniel smiled. Thanks for seeing Mom. Then something changed. He cleared his throat. Actually, doctor, before we begin, There's something I've been worried about. Dr. Carter looked toward him. Go ahead. I assumed he was going to mention my arthritis. Instead, he said quietly, I'm concerned Mom isn't managing very well anymore. The room became strangely silent. Dr. Carter turned back toward me. What do you mean? Daniel sighed heavily. She's becoming forgetful. I blinked. Forgetful. He continued before I could respond. She repeats conversations. I do not, I interrupted. He kept speaking as though he hadn't heard me. She sometimes forgets whether she's taken her medication. Daniel. I've noticed unopened mail sitting around. I organize my mail every afternoon, and a couple of neighbors have mentioned they're worried. That sentence hit me harder than all the others. Neighbors who Grace would never say such a thing. Dr. Carter folded her hands. When did you first begin noticing these changes? Daniel answered immediately. Maybe 6 or 7 months ago. I stared at him. Where was this coming from? I searched Rebecca's face. She avoided my eyes. Dr. Carter looked back toward me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not judgment. Concern. Professional concern. The kind doctors wear when they suspect something serious. Charlene, she said gently, how have you been feeling lately? Fine. Have you noticed any memory changes? No. Any difficulty keeping track of medications? I keep a written medication log. Daniel spoke again. Sometimes she forgets to write in it. I turned toward him. No, I don't. He smiled sympathetically. Mom, you don't always remember. There it was. Not anger, not accusation. Something worse. Patronizing certainty. As though I were a child who simply couldn't understand her own mistakes. Dr. Carter remained calm. I think it might be helpful if we do a brief cognitive screening. I nodded immediately. Of course. Daniel looked almost relieved. Dr. Carter smiled reassuringly. This isn't a test you pass or fail. It simply helps us understand how you're doing. I understand. She began with simple orientation questions. What is today's date? I answered immediately. What day of the week is it? Answered. What city are we in? Answered. She asked me to remember 3 unrelated words. Apple, chair, river. Then she moved on. She asked me to count backward. Spell words in reverse. Identify common objects. Name recent presidents. Describe current events. I answered each question without hesitation. She looked pleasantly surprised. Then came medication questions. What medications are you currently taking? Lisinopril 10 milligrams every morning at 8. Atorvastatin 20 milligrams every evening after dinner. Vitamin D every morning. Calcium supplement with lunch. Any allergies? Penicillin causes hives. When was your last mammogram? October 23rd. When's your next eye appointment? Next Tuesday at 2:15 with Dr. Patel. Dr. Carter glanced down at the chart. Everything matched. She smiled. Excellent. Daniel shifted in his chair. Dr. Carter continued. Who handles your finances? I do. Pays your bills? I do. Balances your accounts? Every Sunday evening. What happens if a bill arrives unexpectedly? I review it, verify the amount and schedule payment through online banking. Again she nodded. Daniel interrupted. She writes everything down because she can't remember. I answered before Dr. Carter could. I write everything down because that's how I've stayed organized for 40 years. Dr. Carter looked at me thoughtfully. Then she asked one final question. If your pharmacy suddenly called and said, one of your prescriptions needed to be changed today, what would you do? I'd ask why. I'd verify the physician authorizing the change. If I had questions, I'd speak directly with you before accepting a new medication. For several seconds, the room was completely silent. Dr. Carter slowly closed my chart. Then she looked directly at Daniel. Charlene's responses are extremely consistent. Daniel forced a smile. She has good days. Something in Dr. Carter's expression changed, very slightly, almost too subtle to notice. But I noticed. It was the first tiny crack in Daniel's carefully constructed story. After finishing the physical examination, Dr. Carter asked Rebecca and Daniel if they'd mind waiting outside for a few minutes while she completed some paperwork with me. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. As the door closed behind them, Dr. Carter lowered her voice. Charlene. Yes. She studied me carefully. I want to ask you something. Go ahead. Has anyone been encouraging you to give up control of your personal affairs? My heart skipped. I hadn't walked into that office expecting to answer that question, and suddenly, I wasn't sure why my doctor was asking it. I didn't answer Dr. Melissa Carter's question right away. Instead, I stared at the framed watercolor painting hanging behind her desk. It showed a quiet Ohio farmhouse surrounded by autumn trees, the kind of peaceful scene that usually calmed me. Not that morning. Has anyone been encouraging you to give up control of your personal affairs? She repeated gently. I looked back at her. My son has been helping more. She nodded but didn't interrupt. I never thought much about it. After my husband died, it seemed natural. He's my only child. And has he asked you to sign documents you didn't fully understand? No. Has he suggested assisted living? No. Has he ever discouraged you from handling your own finances? I hesitated. Not directly. Dr. Carter noticed the pause immediately. Charlene, she said carefully, I'm asking because sometimes family members become overprotective. Sometimes their concern is genuine. Other times, she stopped herself. Other times, I asked. She folded her hands together. Other times, older adults slowly lose control over important decisions without realizing how much has changed. Her words settled heavily between us. I wanted to dismiss them. Instead, my mind began replaying small moments I had ignored. Daniel insisting on driving me everywhere. Daniel asking whether I'd taken medications I'd already logged. Daniel answering questions before I could. Daniel collecting paperwork. Daniel wanting copies of every legal document Thomas and I had ever organized. Until that appointment, each memory had seemed harmless by itself. Together, they looked different. Very different. Dr. Carter handed me a business card. If anything ever feels uncomfortable, call me. I slipped it into my purse. I appreciate that. I also want you to know something. What? Based on everything I've seen today, I have absolutely no concerns about your cognitive abilities. Relief washed over me, then confusion followed immediately afterward. If she believed I was fine, why had Daniel tried so hard to convince her otherwise? I thanked her and stepped into the hallway. Daniel immediately stood. Everything okay? Yes. Dr. Carter smiled politely. We're all finished. Daniel searched her face. Did you notice what I mentioned? She answered professionally. Charlene performed very well during today's evaluation. His smile froze. I'm glad to hear that. But I noticed something. He never looked relieved, only disappointed. The ride home felt strangely quiet. Rebecca kept looking out the passenger window. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. Finally, he spoke. You know, Mom, doctors don't always catch these things early. I looked at him. What things? Memory problems. I don't have memory problems. They can come and go. I answered every question. You happen to have a good day. I almost laughed. A good day. I'd been having good days for nearly 69 years. Instead, I asked quietly, why did you tell Dr. Carter the neighbors were worried? He kept his eyes on the road. They've mentioned little things. Who? Silence. Daniel. I don't remember exactly. That answer bothered me more than anything else he'd said. If someone truly believed I was struggling, surely he would remember who they were. Rebecca finally spoke. I'm sure Daniel was only trying to help. I nodded politely. I'm sure. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure at all. When they dropped me off, Daniel walked me to the front porch. I'll come by Saturday. All right. And maybe we should talk about getting someone to help with household chores. I unlocked my front door. I've managed them just fine. You don't have to prove anything. I smiled. I'm not proving anything. Then I stepped inside before the conversation could continue. The house felt unusually quiet. Not lonely, watchful, as though the walls themselves had heard everything that morning. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and automatically reached for my medication notebook. 8 o'clock. Blood pressure pill. Check. Vitamin D. Check. Exactly as always. Nothing forgotten. Nothing confused. After lunch, I walked to the mailbox. Empty. That surprised me. Normally, I received at least a few pieces of mail every weekday. Perhaps everything had arrived early. Perhaps nothing had been sent. I shrugged and went inside. The next day, the mailbox was empty again. Wednesday. Nothing. Thursday. Nothing. Friday. Still empty. That had never happened before. Friday afternoon, Grace arrived carrying 2 coffees. I figured you could use company. I always can. She followed me into the kitchen. You've been quiet this week. I told her everything about the doctor's appointment. Every question, every answer, every accusation. By the time I finished, Grace's coffee had gone cold. He actually said that he did. She shook her head slowly. Charlene, that's not concern. What do you mean? That's something else. I don't understand why. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Maybe you should start paying closer attention. I nodded. I think I already have. As she prepared to leave, she paused near the front window. By the way, what? I almost forgot. She looked genuinely puzzled. I saw Daniel here Monday. My stomach tightened. Monday. The day before your appointment. He didn't mention coming over. I assumed you knew. What was he doing? Grace frowned. I don't know. I was watering flowers across the street. He walked to your mailbox, opened it, looked through the mail, then drove away. I stared at her. Are you sure? She looked offended. Charlene, I've known that blue pickup truck for 20 years. He definitely opened your mailbox. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps I'd asked him to collect something. No, I hadn't. Perhaps a package. No, there hadn't been one. Federal law suddenly flashed through my mind. Tampering with someone else's mailbox wasn't just unusual. It was illegal. Unless you had permission. I certainly hadn't given any. That evening, I walked outside with a flashlight. The mailbox was empty again. Saturday morning, I decided to organize paperwork in my home office. I opened my filing cabinet. Insurance, taxes, property records. Everything appeared normal. Then I reached for my Medicare correspondence folder. It seemed unusually thin. I frowned. I knew there should have been at least 3 recent explanation of benefit statements inside. There was only one. Perhaps I'd filed them elsewhere. For nearly an hour, I searched every drawer. Nothing. Then I checked my bank statement folder. Again. Several monthly statements were missing. Not all, only the most recent ones. My pulse began quickening. I was not someone who misplaced financial documents. Thomas used to joke that I could locate a receipt from 15 years earlier within 30 seconds. He wasn't exaggerating much. I searched again. Still nothing. At exactly 10:30, my phone rang. Daniel. Morning, Mom. Morning. I'll stop by around noon. Why? I thought I'd help organize some paperwork. The words landed differently now. I've already started. Oh. A pause. Need any help? No. I'm doing fine. Another pause. You sure? Yes. His voice remained cheerful. All right, just trying to make life easier. After we hung up, I sat perfectly still. For the first time, a thought entered my mind that I desperately didn't want to believe. What if the missing documents weren't missing at all? What if someone had removed them? That afternoon, I decided to verify something very simple. I logged into my online bank account. Everything looked normal: balances, payments, deposits. Then I clicked on my personal profile. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just reassurance. Instead, my eyes stopped on one line I had never noticed before. Primary contact for account assistance. Daniel Underwood. I never remembered adding that. And suddenly I found myself wondering one terrifying question. If Daniel's name had quietly appeared there, where else had it appeared without my knowledge? I hardly slept that night. Not because I believed Daniel had stolen money. There was no evidence of that. Every balance in my account was exactly where it should have been. Every automatic payment had gone through on time. Nothing appeared missing. But the question kept circling my mind. Why was my son quietly placing himself between me and every institution that mattered? By Sunday afternoon, I had decided on something Thomas always believed in. When you don't understand something, he'd often say, go to the source instead of guessing. So Monday morning, after finishing my walk around the neighborhood, I drove myself to First Community Bank. Driving there felt strangely important. After Daniel had spent months suggesting I shouldn't drive unless necessary, gripping my own steering wheel felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of myself. The familiar brick building sat exactly where it always had. I'd been banking there for over 30 years. The security guard at the entrance smiled. Good morning, Mrs. Underwood. Good morning, Harold. Even that simple greeting comforted me. People recognized me. They knew who I was. Inside, I asked if Olivia Brooks was available. She had managed my accounts for years. Within a few minutes, she walked into the lobby carrying a tablet. Charlene. She smiled warmly. It's been too long. It has. What can I help you with today? I was hoping to review something on my accounts. Of course. She led me into a small office with glass walls overlooking the lobby. Once we sat down, she asked, everything all right? I think so. I hesitated. I noticed my son is listed as my primary contact. She nodded and pulled up my profile. Yes. I don't remember requesting that. Olivia studied the screen. It appears that information was updated several months ago. Do you know who updated it? She clicked through several records. The request came through paperwork submitted in person. In person? Yes. I frowned. I honestly don't remember doing that. Olivia looked at me carefully. Would you like me to print the authorization? Please. She disappeared for a moment. When she returned, she handed me 2 pages. The signature looked like mine. Almost. I stared at it for several long seconds. Something felt off. The letters leaned differently. The final D in Underwood was shorter than usual. Most people wouldn't notice. I did. Thomas used to tease me that my signature hadn't changed since college. This one wasn't quite right. I don't think I signed this. Olivia didn't immediately respond. Instead, she quietly asked, would you like me to compare it with your signature card on file? Yes. She opened another document. The difference became obvious almost immediately. The signature on file flowed naturally. The newer one looked hesitant, copied, as though someone had practiced it. Olivia remained very professional. I can't determine authenticity. I understand. But I can tell you they don't appear identical. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I asked, what exactly does primary contact allow? It does not give ownership. Relief flickered briefly. But, she continued, it allows us to contact your son first under certain circumstances. What circumstances? If we are unable to reach you. Medical emergencies. Questions regarding unusual account activity. Verification requests. I nodded slowly. So he doesn't control my money? No. But he would receive certain communications before you in some situations. That bothered me deeply. I never intended that. Olivia typed a few notes. We can change it immediately. Please. She slid a form across the desk. This one you'll sign here. I read every word, twice. Only then did I sign. She smiled approvingly. I wish more people read documents this carefully. My husband always insisted. He was a wise man, I smiled sadly. Yes. Before leaving, another question came to mind. Has Daniel requested anything else? Olivia hesitated. May I ask why you're concerned? I debated how much to say. Finally, I answered honestly. My doctor recently asked whether anyone had been encouraging me to give up control of my affairs. Olivia's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, recognition. She leaned back in her chair. Charlene. Yes. I want to be careful about what I say. I appreciate that. But I also believe clients deserve transparency. She opened another section of my account history. There have been several inquiries. Inquiries, not transactions. Questions. What kind of questions? She turned the monitor toward me. 3 dates appeared, each only weeks apart. Daniel Underwood, account access procedures, joint ownership requirements, power of attorney documentation. I stared at the screen. I never asked him to do that. Olivia nodded. I assumed perhaps you had. No. He specifically asked about adding himself to the account. Yes. And what did you tell him? That we would need your authorization. Did he seem upset? She smiled politely. I don't generally describe clients. I understand. But I will say, she paused carefully. He asked very detailed questions. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Daniel hadn't accidentally become more involved. He'd been researching, planning, learning procedures. I thanked Olivia for her honesty. Before I stood, she quietly reached into a drawer and handed me a business card. On the back, she wrote 2 words: Benjamin Lawson, Elder Law. I looked up. Who's this? One of the best elder law attorneys in Franklin County. I don't think I need a lawyer. I sincerely hope you don't. She met my eyes. But if something doesn't feel right, she let the sentence hang unfinished. Talk to someone before signing anything. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking. Daniel had asked about joint ownership, power of attorney, account access. Questions ordinary people rarely asked without a reason. Yet he had never mentioned any of those conversations to me. Why keep them secret? By the time I reached home, another thought occurred to me. If Daniel had quietly contacted the bank, had he contacted anyone else, I walked directly to my filing cabinet. This time I wasn't searching randomly. I made a list: bank, insurance, Medicare, property taxes, Social Security, primary physician, pharmacy, utilities. One by one I began calling. Most conversations were completely ordinary. Then I reached my prescription provider. After verifying my identity, the representative cheerfully said, I see Daniel Underwood is also listed as someone authorized to discuss your prescriptions. I never requested that. There was a pause. Our records indicate authorization was received approximately 7 months ago. Again. 7 months. Almost exactly the same time everything else had begun changing. I thanked her and requested his authorization be removed immediately. She complied without hesitation. Next came my supplemental insurance company. Same answer. Daniel listed as authorized contact. Then Medicare. Emergency contact updated. Then my property insurance. Again. Daniel. Every call uncovered another small change. None gave him complete control. But together, they created a pattern, a network, almost as though someone wanted every important phone call to pass through him first. Late that afternoon, Grace knocked on my front door. The moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. What happened? I invited her inside. For nearly an hour, I told her everything: the bank, the authorizations, the signatures, the inquiries. She listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she whispered, Oh, Charlene. I keep hoping there's an innocent explanation. Grace sighed. I hope there is too. But hope shouldn't replace caution. I rubbed my temples. I don't understand what he's trying to do. She looked at me thoughtfully. Maybe someone else will. What do you mean? She pointed toward the business card lying beside my coffee cup. Go talk to that attorney. I've never hired a lawyer in my life. Then maybe it's time. The following morning, I found myself sitting inside Benjamin Lawson's downtown office. The walls were lined with law books and framed newspaper articles about elder fraud cases. He greeted me warmly before inviting me to sit. So, he folded his hands. What brings you here today, Mrs. Underwood? I slid Olivia's business card across his desk. My banker thinks I should talk to you. He smiled faintly. Olivia doesn't send people here without a reason. I nodded. That's exactly what worries me. For the next 45 minutes, I carefully described everything that had happened: the doctor's appointment, Daniel's accusations, the missing mail, the changing account contacts, the authorization questions. Benjamin never interrupted. He simply took notes. When I finally finished, he closed his notebook slowly. Then he looked directly into my eyes. "Mrs. Underwood." His voice had become noticeably more serious. "I believe your son may not be trying to take your money today." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "But," he continued, "I do believe someone may be laying the legal groundwork to convince others that you are no longer capable of making your own decisions." Those words chilled me far more than anything I had heard so far, because suddenly, every strange event from the past several months fit together like pieces of the same puzzle. Benjamin Lawson didn't say another word for several seconds. He simply watched my face as I tried to absorb what he had just told me. "I don't understand," I finally whispered. He leaned forward. "I know this is difficult to hear. I've never even imagined my own son would—" My voice faded. Benjamin nodded with the patience of someone who had witnessed this conversation many times before. "Mrs. Underwood, let me be absolutely clear. At this moment, I am not accusing Daniel of committing a crime." I appreciated his precision. "What I am saying," he continued, "is that the pattern you've described is consistent with cases I've handled involving adults whose independence was slowly challenged before legal action was taken." What kind of legal action? Guardianship. The word landed like a stone. I'd heard it before, usually in stories involving severe dementia or devastating illness. Not people like me. That can't happen without proof. No, it cannot. Which is exactly why documentation becomes so important. He tapped the notebook in front of him. If someone wanted to convince a court that you could no longer safely manage your affairs, they would need evidence. I felt my stomach tighten. The doctor's appointment could become evidence. The comments about memory could become evidence. The changes in emergency contacts, they help create the appearance that someone else has already begun managing your affairs. I rubbed my forehead. It sounds so calculated. Benjamin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a legal folder from his desk. "May I explain how guardianship petitions often begin?" I nodded. "They rarely begin in court. They begin with small records." He counted them one by one. A physician's note, a concerned family member, a bank inquiry, a report that someone appears confused, a statement that medications are being forgotten. Each item alone means very little. But together, he closed the folder. They begin telling a story. The words sent a chill through me. A story. Daniel wasn't simply making accusations, he was creating a narrative, one that other people might eventually believe. Benjamin looked at me kindly. "I think it's time we begin collecting your own evidence." "What kind?" "The truth." He smiled gently. "The wonderful thing about truth is that it usually leaves records." He handed me a yellow legal pad. Across the top, he wrote documentation timeline. Start from the beginning. What should I include? Everything. The doctor's appointment. The missing mail. The banking changes. Every conversation. Every date you remember. Every document. He paused. Details matter. I spent nearly 2 hours reconstructing the previous year. Surprisingly, my notebooks helped enormously. Because I documented appointments and activities every day, I could verify dates with remarkable accuracy. Benjamin seemed impressed. "You've always kept records like this. For decades." He smiled. "Your organizational habits may become your strongest witness." Before I left, he handed me another list. "I'd also like you to request complete copies of your medical records." My records. Every office note. Every telephone message. Every communication. I've never asked for them before. Most people don't. He looked at me seriously. "But I think you should." The following morning, I returned to Riverside Family Medical Center. Walking through those doors felt different than it had only a few days earlier. I wasn't there as a patient. I was there looking for answers. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Good morning, Mrs. Underwood." "Good morning." I'd like copies of my complete medical records. She smiled. Certainly. It may take a little while. I can wait. About 20 minutes later, a medical records clerk appeared carrying a thick envelope. Everything from the past 3 years. I thanked her and drove straight home. I made tea before opening the envelope. Somehow it felt like preparing for an exam. Most of the records looked exactly as expected. Blood pressure, lab work, annual physicals, vaccinations, everything normal. Then I reached a section labeled Telephone Communications. I frowned. There were far more entries than I expected. The first note read, "Patient's son called expressing concern regarding increasing forgetfulness." Date: 8 months earlier. I stared at the page. I had never known about that call. The next note, family reports patient occasionally forgets medications. 7 months earlier. Another son concerned patient repeats conversations multiple times daily. 6 months earlier. Another. Family worried patient may no longer safely manage finances. 5 months earlier. Each note was short, professional, objective, but together. They painted a picture I barely recognized. I kept reading. One sentence nearly made me drop the papers. Recommended closer observation at next annual visit. That recommendation had been entered 4 months before my appointment. Months. Long before Dr. Carter had ever asked me a single memory question. I suddenly understood why she'd looked concerned when Daniel spoke. She'd already read months of documented concerns, none of which had come from me. I immediately called Benjamin. "I think you should come in." Within an hour, I was back in his office. He carefully reviewed every page. Finally, he sighed. "This is exactly what I was worried about." They believed him. They documented what he reported. But no one asked me. They usually don't during telephone updates from family. He tapped another page. Notice the wording. I looked closer. Family reports. Son states. Concern expressed by caregiver. Not physician observation. Reported information. Benjamin nodded. That's important. So these aren't medical findings, no. They're records of what someone told the doctor. Relief mixed with anger. But once they're written, they begin looking official. He was right. Ink had a frightening power. Words written inside a medical chart somehow felt more believable than spoken conversations. Benjamin placed several sticky notes throughout the file. I'd like to discuss these with Dr. Carter. Do you think she'll meet with us? I hope so. The appointment was scheduled 2 days later. When I walked into Dr. Carter's office again, I carried my copy of the records. She greeted me warmly. "Charlene." "I'm glad you came." Benjamin introduced himself. Dr. Carter immediately understood why we were there. "I reviewed your chart after our last visit," she admitted before either of us spoke. "I realized something that concerns me." She opened my medical file on her computer. Many of these entries came from telephone conversations with Daniel. "I never knew they existed," I said quietly. "I should have discussed them with you sooner." She sounded genuinely regretful. Benjamin asked calmly, "Doctor, based on your direct examination of Mrs. Underwood, do you currently have concerns regarding her cognitive capacity?" "No. None." "You've performed screening?" "Yes." "Her results were entirely appropriate." "What about medication management?" "Excellent." "Financial reasoning?" "Based on our conversations, entirely intact." She turned toward me. "Charlene, I owe you an apology." I blinked. When Daniel called over the past several months, I believed he was sharing genuine concerns. She looked genuinely distressed. Family members often notice changes before physicians do. I understand. But I relied too heavily on his descriptions. She took a deep breath. "After meeting with you personally," she paused, "I no longer believe those reports accurately reflected your condition." Those words lifted a tremendous weight from my shoulders. Benjamin nodded approvingly. "Would you be willing to document your updated clinical opinion?" "Absolutely." Without hesitation, no defensiveness, no excuses. She immediately dictated an addendum. Patient demonstrates intact memory, judgment, medication, knowledge orientation, and decision-making abilities. Previous concerns reported by family are not supported by current clinical evaluation. Hearing those words nearly brought tears to my eyes. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, someone had officially recorded the truth. As we prepared to leave, Dr. Carter hesitated. "There is one more thing." Benjamin and I both looked at her. She turned toward her computer and opened another section of my chart. "I almost forgot this." "What is it?" I asked. She frowned. "Several months ago, someone from a senior care placement agency contacted our office requesting confirmation that concerns had been raised regarding your cognitive decline." I stared at her. "A senior care placement agency?" "Yes." "I told them I couldn't discuss your records. But they specifically asked whether documentation of memory concerns existed." Benjamin slowly closed his notebook. Neither of us spoke for several seconds, because we both understood exactly what that meant. Someone hadn't merely been asking questions anymore. Someone had already begun exploring what would happen after everyone believed I could no longer live independently. For nearly 48 hours after leaving Dr. Carter's office, I moved through my normal routine as though nothing had changed. I still watered my flowers every morning. I still volunteered at the library on Wednesday. I still met Grace for coffee on Friday afternoon. If anyone had watched me from across the street, they would have seen the same Charlene Underwood they had known for years. Only one thing was different. I had stopped trusting appearances. Benjamin Lawson had given me one piece of advice before I left his office. "Don't confront Daniel." "Why not?" "Because if we're right, he doesn't yet know you understand what's happening. So I should pretend, for now. The truth has an easier time revealing itself when people believe they're still in control." It sounded almost impossible. Daniel was my son. Every instinct told me to demand an explanation. Instead, I waited. And while I waited, Benjamin began investigating. 3 days later, he called. "Can you come by this afternoon?" His tone was calm. Too calm. When I arrived, he already had several folders spread across his conference table. "I've learned a little more." I sat down quietly. "About Daniel." He nodded. "Most of what I found comes from public records." He slid the first folder toward me. "I'd like you to read these." The first page was a civil court filing. Daniel Underwood, defendant, breach of contract. The case had been filed almost 11 months earlier. I frowned. "He never mentioned this." Benjamin nodded. "There were several." He handed me another. Then another. None involved criminal charges. Instead, they described failed business agreements, unpaid consulting fees, and disputes over investment partnerships. One lawsuit had been settled, another remained active, a third had been dismissed, but together they painted a troubling picture. "This doesn't look like the successful financial advisor he talks about," I murmured. Benjamin folded his hands. "It isn't." He opened another file. "This comes from property records. Daniel and Rebecca had purchased a beautiful home 5 years earlier. I'd attended the housewarming party. It had seemed like a dream come true for them." Benjamin pointed toward one document. "Notice this. Mortgage delinquency notice. 93 days overdue." I stared at the date. Only 4 months ago. He never told me. I doubt he wanted anyone to know. My chest tightened. Daniel had always been proud, painfully proud. Even as a teenager, he'd rather struggle alone than admit failure. Benjamin continued. "There are also several recorded liens, tax obligations, business debt, and 2 personal loans." I slowly leaned back in my chair. This wasn't simply financial pressure, this was desperation. He told me business was excellent. Benjamin gave me a sympathetic smile. People in financial trouble often become very good storytellers. I looked down at the stack of documents. For the first time since all this had begun, I stopped asking whether Daniel had a reason. He clearly did. Now the question had changed. How far was he willing to go? Benjamin reached for another folder. "I found something else." Inside were records from the Ohio Secretary of State. Daniel's investment consulting company had officially dissolved 8 months earlier. Exactly 8 months. Almost the same time his phone calls to Dr. Carter had begun. The timing couldn't be ignored. Business collapses. Medical concerns appear. Financial questions begin. Mail changes. Account inquiries. Every event fit into the same timeline. I whispered the thought before I realized I was speaking aloud. It started when he lost everything. Benjamin nodded. I believe that's very possible. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question I had been avoiding. If someone became his guardian, Benjamin corrected me gently. If someone became your guardian, I nodded. If Daniel became my guardian, he spoke carefully. A guardian doesn't automatically own your property. Relief flickered. But, he continued, they often gain authority over financial decisions. They may control bank accounts, pay bills, manage investments, sell property under court supervision if approved. My heart sank. My house. It could become vulnerable. Thomas had built that home with his own hands. Every room carried memories. The kitchen where Daniel had learned to bake chocolate chip cookies. The backyard where Thomas taught him baseball. The living room where Christmas mornings had stretched across decades. I suddenly realized something heartbreaking. Daniel wasn't just looking at a house. He was looking at equity. Benjamin seemed to read my thoughts. To someone drowning in debt, a paid-off home represents security. I closed my eyes. Thomas had spent 30 years making mortgage payments. He'd worked summer jobs, tutored students after school, delayed vacations, driven older cars. Not because he loved money, because he wanted me to be safe. The idea that everything he'd sacrificed might become someone else's rescue plan made my throat ache. Benjamin interrupted my thoughts gently. I need to ask you something difficult. Go ahead. If Daniel approached you tomorrow asking you to sign paperwork, I wouldn't. What if he told you it was only insurance paperwork? I'd read every page. What if he became emotional? I'd still read it. He smiled faintly. Good. Then his expression became serious again. I don't believe he's going to stop. You think he'll continue? I think financial desperation rarely disappears overnight. When I left his office, Columbus looked strangely unfamiliar. The streets hadn't changed, neither had the buildings, yet everything felt different. When trust disappears, even ordinary places begin feeling uncertain. That Saturday, Daniel arrived exactly at noon. He carried a bakery box. Your favorite cinnamon rolls. Thank you. He hugged me as though nothing had happened. Rebecca smiled warmly. We thought we'd spend the afternoon together. I invited them inside. For nearly an hour we chatted about ordinary things: church, weather, my tomatoes, Rebecca's garden, Daniel's golf game. Anyone listening would have believed we were a perfectly happy family. Then Daniel casually said, I've been thinking. I looked up. About what? Maybe it's time we simplified a few things. Simplified your finances. I smiled politely. They're already simple. You've got so many accounts: checking, savings, retirement, insurance. It might be easier if someone helped oversee everything. Someone, not you. Someone. He deliberately avoided saying the word. I took a sip of coffee. I appreciate the thought. I don't need help. He laughed softly. Everybody needs help eventually. I looked directly into his eyes. I'm not there yet. His smile faded just slightly. Rebecca quickly changed the subject. Charlene, these cinnamon rolls smell wonderful. I silently thanked her. But I noticed something else. Daniel barely touched his coffee. Instead, his eyes wandered around my office, toward the filing cabinet, toward my desk, toward the bookshelf where Thomas had hidden important documents years earlier. He wasn't looking at the room. He was inventorying it. After they left, I walked upstairs and stood inside my bedroom. Thomas's photograph rested on the dresser beside his old wristwatch. I picked up the picture. You always told me people reveal themselves when they're afraid. I smiled sadly. I just wish you'd been wrong this once. That evening, Benjamin called again. I've scheduled something. What? I'd like an investigator to perform a routine financial background review. Is that really necessary? I think we're still missing one piece. What piece? He paused. We know Daniel's finances collapsed. We know he contacted your doctor. We know he contacted your bank. But we still don't know why he suddenly became so desperate. I nodded slowly. What if it's worse than we think? Benjamin's answer came quietly. That's exactly what I'm trying to find out. The next morning, I attended church as usual. After the service, several friends gathered around me. One woman smiled warmly. It's so nice Daniel checks on you all the time. Another added, You're lucky to have such a devoted son. I forced myself to smile. I've always believed that. But as I walked back to my car, another painful realization settled over me. Daniel hadn't only been building records, he'd been building a reputation. To everyone around us, he appeared to be the loving son, caring for his aging mother. If this ever reached a courtroom, people wouldn't begin by questioning Daniel. They would begin by admiring him. And suddenly I understood just how carefully this entire story had been written. The only problem for Daniel was that he had underestimated one thing. He believed he was the only person keeping records. I had no idea that Thomas had spent a lifetime teaching me that the truth, when patiently documented, could become stronger than any carefully constructed lie. If there was one lesson Thomas had repeated throughout our marriage, it was this: never argue with assumptions when you can answer them with facts. For 39 years, those words had guided everything from balancing our household budget to resolving disagreements with insurance companies. Now they became the foundation of something much more important. I wasn't going to convince anyone by insisting Daniel was lying. I was going to let the evidence speak. Benjamin Lawson and I met early Monday morning in his office. He had transformed one wall of his conference room into what looked almost like a detective's investigation board. A large calendar stretched across the center. Colored notes marked phone calls, appointments, and document requests. Strings connected dates, copies of medical notes, bank records, mail records. At first glance, it seemed overwhelming. After a few minutes, a pattern became impossible to ignore. It all begins here, Benjamin said, pointing to a date nearly 9 months earlier. The week Daniel's investment company officially dissolved. He moved his finger forward. Within 2 weeks, he tapped another note. First phone call to Dr. Carter expressing concern about your memory. Another note. 3 weeks later, inquiry at your bank regarding joint ownership. Another. Emergency contact updates. Another. Mail begins disappearing. Another. Questions about power of attorney. Another. Senior care placement agency contacts your physician. He looked at me. This isn't random. No. It's a progression. I stared at the timeline. For months, I had experienced each event separately. Standing in Benjamin's office, I saw them together for the first time. Each step prepared for the next. None of them alone could take away my independence. Together, they slowly built a picture that wasn't true. Benjamin slid a notebook toward me. From today forward, I want you to document everything. I already keep journals. I know. But now I want details. He wrote several headings: date, time, location, who was present, exact words spoken, witnesses, supporting documents. Don't summarize conversations. Quote them. Memory fades. Written records don't. I nodded. I can do that. I know you can. That afternoon I began. The first entry described my meeting with Benjamin. The second documented every conversation from my appointment with Dr. Carter. The third listed every institution where Daniel's name had quietly appeared. By bedtime, I had filled nearly 12 pages. Oddly enough, writing everything down made me feel calmer. The truth looked much less frightening when it was organized. 3 days later, another opportunity presented itself. Daniel called. Morning, Mom. Good morning. I was thinking about stopping by after work. That would be nice. I also wanted to help organize your office. I smiled even though he couldn't see me. My office is already organized. I know. But maybe we could simplify things. Simplify. That word again. I'll make dinner, I replied. You don't have to. I'd like to. He agreed. The moment I hung up, I opened my notebook. Wednesday, 9:12 a.m. Daniel suggested simplifying office paperwork again. Benjamin had encouraged me to document repeated themes. This was now the third time Daniel had mentioned organizing my records. That evening he arrived alone. Rebecca was visiting her parents. We ate roasted chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, and homemade rolls. Almost everything felt normal. He complimented the meal, asked about church, talked about football. Then, as I poured coffee, he casually said, "You know, Mom, yes, I've been reading about identity theft. Oh, older people are becoming targets. They are. I worry about someone taking advantage of you." I appreciate the concern. He nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking maybe I should keep copies of all your important documents. I nearly smiled. He had no idea I already knew he possessed copies. What kind of documents? Oh. He shrugged casually. Insurance. Property records. Bank information. Medical directives. Just in case. I stirred my coffee slowly. I thought you already scanned most of those. His eyes flickered for the briefest moment. Barely noticeable. Then he laughed. You're right. I forgot. Forgot. Interesting choice of words. I quietly added that sentence to my memory. People who tell the truth rarely forget what they've already admitted. After dinner, we walked into my home office. Daniel looked around. Everything's still in the same filing cabinet. Yes. I've never needed to move anything. He opened one drawer. I watched silently. He wasn't searching. He was checking, almost as if confirming something remained where he expected. Finally, he closed it. Looks good. I nodded. It always has. He smiled. I'm glad you're keeping everything together. As he drove away that evening, I immediately documented the conversation. Benjamin reviewed my notes the next morning. Excellent. What stands out to you? He keeps returning to the same subjects. Paperwork. Documents. Organization. Benjamin nodded. Exactly. He circled several repeated phrases. Just in case. Simplify. Help. Those words sound harmless. They do. But repeated language often reveals long-term objectives. Another week passed. Benjamin's investigator finally completed his report. When we met again, he looked unusually serious. I found something important. He handed me several printed emails obtained through lawful discovery connected to one of Daniel's business disputes. Most concerned failed investments, clients demanding explanations, late payments, canceled partnerships. Then Benjamin turned to another page. This one caught my attention. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't even about me. It was an email Daniel had sent to a former business partner nearly 7 months earlier. One sentence stood out. If I can stabilize things before the bank moves, I'll have enough equity available within the year. I frowned. What equity? Benjamin looked directly at me. I don't think he was talking about his house. Neither of us needed to say the next words aloud. My house. Benjamin continued. The investigator also confirmed Daniel met twice with a financial restructuring consultant. What does that mean? They discussed debt consolidation. One recommendation appears repeatedly. He handed me another page. Access to family assets if legally available. I read the sentence 3 times. Family assets. To an outside consultant, I wasn't Daniel's mother. I was an asset. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money, because somewhere along the way, my son had begun looking at me differently. That evening, Grace came over after choir practice. She found me sitting on the porch watching the sunset. You've been awfully quiet. I handed her the investigator's report. She read slowly. When she finished, tears filled her eyes. I'm so sorry. So am I. For him. I nodded. I keep wondering where I lost my little boy. Grace squeezed my hand. You didn't lose him. He made choices. I know. But mothers always search for the moment they could have changed the ending. She didn't argue, because she knew I was right. Every mother does. Before leaving, Grace said something that stayed with me. Charlene. Yes. Whatever happens, Don't let guilt convince you to ignore the truth. I promised I wouldn't. 2 mornings later, my promise was tested. At exactly 8:47 a.m., Daniel called unexpectedly. Morning, Mom. Good morning. I've got some paperwork from my accountant. Oh. He suggested families complete emergency financial information forms. I remained silent. It'll only take a few signatures. My pulse quickened. What kind of forms? Oh. He laughed lightly. Nothing complicated. They just make things easier if something ever happens. I thought about Benjamin's advice. Never refuse immediately. Ask questions. Bring them over. I'd rather read them first. There was a pause. Longer than usual. Finally, he answered, Sure. I'll stop by tomorrow. After we hung up, I called Benjamin immediately. His response came without hesitation. Don't sign anything. I won't. And Charlene? Yes. I think we've reached the point where Daniel believes you're ready. Ready for what? Benjamin's voice became very quiet. Ready to voluntarily give him exactly what he hasn't been able to obtain any other way. I looked toward the empty driveway outside my window. Tomorrow. For the first time since this nightmare began. Daniel wasn't just coming to visit his mother. He was coming with papers. And somehow, I already knew those papers would change everything. The next morning I woke before dawn. Not because I was anxious, because I wanted my mind to be perfectly clear. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't reacting to Daniel's decisions. I was preparing for my own. Benjamin had arranged for me to undergo an independent cognitive evaluation with Dr. Nathan Reynolds, one of the most respected geriatric specialists in Central Ohio. Unlike my annual physical with Dr. Carter, this examination had only one purpose: to objectively determine whether I was capable of managing my own affairs. If this ever reaches court, Benjamin had explained, an independent evaluation from someone with no prior relationship to you will carry tremendous weight. I agreed immediately. If someone was questioning my mind, I wanted the truth documented by someone who had no reason to favor either side. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into the Center for Healthy Aging. The receptionist smiled warmly. Mrs. Underwood. Yes. Dr. Reynolds is expecting you. Benjamin had offered to accompany me, but I declined. If I'm proving I can manage my own life, I'd told him, I should start by attending my own appointments. He had smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. A few moments later, Dr. Nathan Reynolds entered the waiting room. He looked to be in his early 60s with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades listening more than talking. Mrs. Underwood. He extended his hand. I'm Nathan Reynolds. It's nice to meet you. He led me into a bright office with large windows overlooking a small garden. Unlike most examination rooms, there wasn't an examination table in sight. Instead, there were comfortable chairs, bookshelves, puzzles, and several clipboards. I know evaluations like this can feel intimidating, he said. I'll admit I'm a little nervous. He smiled kindly. That's completely normal. Then he added something that immediately put me at ease. I'm not looking for reasons to fail you. I'm simply looking for the truth. For nearly 3 hours, he asked questions unlike any I'd ever been asked by a physician. Some seemed simple. Others required careful thought. What did you have for dinner last night? Roast chicken, green beans, and baked potatoes. What newspaper do you read? The Columbus Dispatch. Tell me about yesterday from the moment you woke up. I described my morning walk, watering my flowers, driving to the grocery store, calling Grace, reviewing paperwork, writing in my journal. He nodded but rarely reacted. Then the questions became more complicated. If your checking account suddenly showed a withdrawal you didn't recognize, what would you do? I'd first verify whether it was pending or completed. Then I'd review my records, contact the bank directly, and document every conversation before authorizing any action. He made another note. What would you do if someone pressured you to sign documents you didn't understand? I wouldn't sign them. What if that person was a family member? I still wouldn't sign them. Why? Because relationships don't replace responsibility. He looked up from his notes for the first time. That's an interesting answer. It's one my husband taught me. He smiled slightly. I imagine he was a thoughtful man. He was. The evaluation continued. Mental arithmetic, problem solving, pattern recognition, language exercises, memory testing. He asked me to draw a clock showing a specific time. I did. He asked me to remember a list of words while completing unrelated tasks. An hour later, I repeated every one of them. He gave me hypothetical situations involving insurance claims, medication schedules, unexpected home repairs, and investment decisions. None felt impossible. They felt like ordinary parts of adulthood. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. I have one final exercise. He handed me a mock monthly budget. It included Social Security income retirement withdrawals, utility bills, groceries, insurance premiums, and several unexpected expenses. Show me how you would adjust this budget if the roof suddenly needed replacement. I studied the page carefully. I wouldn't immediately touch retirement investments. What would you do? I'd first obtain multiple repair estimates. If emergency savings covered most of the expense, I'd use those. If not, I'd postpone discretionary spending before considering long-term investments. He nodded. What discretionary spending? Vacation. Charitable gifts above my planned amount. Dining out. Non-essential purchases. What wouldn't you reduce to? Medication. Homeowner's insurance. Property taxes. Routine maintenance. Those prevent much larger expenses later. He smiled. I think we're finished. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. How do you think I did? He chuckled softly. You know I can't discuss conclusions before completing my report. I had to ask. I understand. As I gathered my purse, he stopped me. There is one question I'd like to ask that isn't part of the formal evaluation. Of course. Why do you believe you're here today? I looked out the window toward the garden. Then I answered honestly. Because someone I love has mistaken control for care. He remained silent. I don't believe my son woke up one morning wanting to hurt me. But somewhere along the way, I struggled to finish the sentence. He stopped seeing me as a person who could make decisions. Dr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. That distinction matters. It does. As I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. Mrs. Underwood. Yes. I've performed these evaluations for more than 25 years. I waited. I can't discuss your official report until it's finalized. I understand. But I can tell you something else. What? You came here alone. You completed every form yourself. You understood every consent document before signing. You asked thoughtful questions. You advocated for yourself. He smiled warmly. Never underestimate how much those things reveal. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this ordeal began. Hope. The following afternoon, Benjamin called. The report is finished. I drove to his office immediately. He was already reading the document when I arrived. The moment he looked up, I saw relief in his face. Sit down. I did. Without speaking, he handed me the final page. My eyes immediately found the conclusion. Clinical impression. Mrs. Charlene Underwood demonstrates intact cognition, excellent executive functioning, appropriate judgment, strong financial reasoning, and full capacity to independently manage her personal medical and financial affairs. I find no clinical evidence supporting guardianship or restrictions upon her independent decision-making. I read it twice, then a third time. My eyes blurred with tears. Benjamin smiled. I was hoping you'd react exactly like that. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything. He gently tapped the report. This says everything. He flipped back several pages. There are additional comments. I continued reading. The patient demonstrates exceptional organizational skills. Medication management is precise and well documented. Insight and reasoning are above average. Decision-making remains fully intact. No evidence of dementia, mild cognitive impairment, or executive dysfunction. Each sentence felt like another piece of my voice being returned to me. Benjamin leaned back. If Daniel ever files for guardianship, he'll see this. Yes. And any judge will see it. Relief settled over me for only a moment before Benjamin's expression became serious again. There's something else. What? He slid another envelope across the desk. This arrived this morning. The return address made my heart stop. Franklin County Probate Court. I looked up at him. What is it? Benjamin's voice remained calm. I believe Daniel has decided not to wait any longer. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. The first line read, Notice of petition for appointment of guardian. My own son had officially asked the court to declare that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. For just a second, the room went completely silent. Then Benjamin quietly placed Dr. Reynolds' report beside the petition. They've made the first move, he said. Now. He looked directly into my eyes. We're ready to answer. For a long moment, I couldn't take my eyes off the first page of the petition. In the matter of Charlene Underwood. My name looked strangely unfamiliar when printed beneath the words, Alleged Incapacitated Adult. I had spent nearly 69 years building a life defined by responsibility, careful decisions, and independence. Now, in a single legal document, I had become someone's allegation. I looked up at Benjamin. Did he really do this? Benjamin nodded quietly. He did. Can he simply file something like this? Anyone with legal standing can file a petition. Winning it is something entirely different. He slid another folder toward me. I've already reviewed everything. Inside were copies of Daniel's filing. Each page hurt more than the one before. Daniel claimed I had become forgetful, that I struggled to remember medications, that I was vulnerable to financial exploitation, that I resisted assistance because I lacked insight into my declining condition. There were even statements saying I had become isolated. I almost laughed. Isolated, I volunteered every week, attended church twice a week, met Grace regularly, spoke with neighbors almost every day. Benjamin watched me carefully. What stands out? He mixed tiny pieces of truth with enormous lies. Exactly. He pointed to one paragraph. Mrs. Underwood prefers to remain at home despite increasing safety concerns. I do prefer to remain at home. But there are no safety concerns. That's why wording matters. He highlighted another sentence. Family has attempted to assist for several months. That's technically true. But it doesn't explain why. I slowly began understanding something. Daniel hadn't invented everything. He had simply rearranged reality. Each sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Together they created an entirely false picture. Benjamin opened another folder. Our response begins today. He had already organized dozens of tabs. Medical records, bank records, timeline, witness list, independent evaluation, mail records, character references. Every document was labeled with remarkable precision. I like organized people, he said with a smile. So did my husband. I can tell. He handed me another legal pad. I need names. Names? Everyone who has observed your daily life. I immediately began writing. Grace Whitmore, Olivia Brooks, Dr. Melissa Carter, Dr. Nathan Reynolds, Pastor David Collins, Library Director Susan Keller, Volunteer Coordinator Megan Ellis, my next-door neighbor Harold Jenkins, the pharmacist who had filled my prescriptions for years. Benjamin nodded approvingly. Excellent. We're not trying to prove perfection. We're proving consistency. That afternoon, he began making calls. The first person to arrive was Grace. She walked into Benjamin's office carrying a folder nearly as thick as mine. I brought everything. Benjamin smiled. What exactly is everything? Grace looked almost offended. Charlene has lived across from me for 25 years. I keep Christmas cards, neighborhood newsletters, photos, community volunteer schedules. I even printed text messages. Benjamin laughed softly. I already like you. Grace sat beside me. I figured someone should tell the truth. Benjamin asked her several questions. How often do you see Charlene? Almost daily. Has she ever appeared confused? No. Does she drive safely? Better than half the people in Columbus. Does she manage her own shopping? Every week. Cooking. Every day. Appointments. She reminds me about mine. Benjamin smiled while taking notes. Then he asked something unexpected. Has Daniel ever visited when Charlene wasn't home? Grace thought for a moment. Several times. My head turned. What? She looked at me apologetically. I didn't think much about it then. When? Mostly during weekdays. I assumed you'd asked him to check something. Benjamin immediately looked interested. Did you ever see what he was doing? She frowned. Usually he'd walk around the property. Sometimes he'd check the mailbox. Twice I saw him trying the garage door. I felt my stomach tighten. I never asked him to. Benjamin quietly wrote every word. After Grace left, Olivia Brooks arrived from the bank. She brought certified account records, signature comparisons, authorization timelines, internal notes. Benjamin asked her only factual questions. When was Daniel's first inquiry? 8 months ago. Did Mrs. Underwood request those inquiries? No. Did Daniel ask how guardianship affected financial management? Yes. I looked toward Olivia. You remember that? She nodded. I remember because it wasn't an ordinary question. Benjamin continued. Did you approve any ownership changes? No. Why not? We required Mrs. Underwood's direct authorization. And did she provide it? No. Olivia hesitated before adding one final sentence. Mrs. Underwood has always handled her banking personally. She's one of our most organized clients. Benjamin thanked her. When she left, he leaned back in his chair. Every witness tells the same story. The truth usually does. Over the next week, our evidence continued growing. The library director wrote a detailed statement describing my volunteer work. She noted that I managed inventory records, organized community literacy events, and trained new volunteers. If Charlene couldn't organize her own life, Susan wrote she certainly couldn't organize ours. Pastor Collins submitted another letter. He described my role managing church donation records. I smiled when I read one sentence. Charlene corrects accounting errors the rest of us overlook. Benjamin chuckled. I imagine that's true. It is. Even my pharmacist contributed. He documented that I consistently requested refills on schedule, asked informed questions about medications, and independently managed every prescription. Each letter strengthened our case. But something else happened that I hadn't expected. The more people Benjamin interviewed, the more stories emerged. One afternoon, Harold Jenkins, my retired next-door neighbor, stopped by the office. I think I should mention something. Benjamin invited him to sit. Harold cleared his throat. About 6 months ago, I was trimming my hedges. I saw Daniel carrying boxes out of Charlene's garage. I frowned. Boxes? Harold nodded. I assumed you'd asked him. I didn't. Do you remember what was inside? No. But I remember he loaded them into his truck. Benjamin asked carefully, did Mrs. Underwood appear to know about it? I never saw her. Again, Benjamin wrote everything down. After Harold left, I felt emotionally exhausted. I don't understand. Benjamin closed his notebook. We may never understand every decision Daniel made. But we don't have to. We only have to establish facts. Late Friday afternoon, Benjamin's assistant walked into the conference room carrying another envelope. It just arrived. Benjamin read the return address. Then he sighed. What's wrong? It's the court scheduling order. He opened the envelope. The hearing has been set. How soon? 3 weeks. Only 3 weeks. Everything suddenly felt very real. Benjamin remained calm. We'll be ready. I know. But there's one thing I still don't understand. What? If Daniel knows about Dr. Reynolds' evaluation, he doesn't. I blinked. He doesn't know. The report isn't automatically sent to him. He only knows you attended an appointment. I looked out the office window. So he still believes I'm unprepared. Benjamin smiled. I believe he does. For the first time since this began, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not fear, confidence, because Daniel had built his case believing I would quietly accept it. He still imagined the frightened woman sitting silently in Dr. Carter's office while he answered every question. He had no idea that woman no longer existed. As I gathered my purse to leave, Benjamin walked me to the elevator. Charlene. Yes. There's one more thing. What is it? I've handled elder law cases for 28 years. He smiled warmly. I've rarely seen someone prepare as carefully as you have. I laughed softly. Thomas always said preparation was another form of courage. Benjamin nodded. He was right. The elevator doors opened. As I stepped inside, my phone buzzed. One new message, from Daniel. Mom, I know the court paperwork probably upset you. I hope you'll understand I'm only doing this because I love you. Maybe we can talk before the hearing. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I quietly slipped the phone back into my purse. For months, Daniel had been writing a story about me. Now, for the first time, he was about to discover that I had been writing one too. And unlike his version, mine came with evidence. For a long moment, I couldn't take my eyes off the first page of the petition. In the matter of Charlene Underwood, my name looked strangely unfamiliar when printed beneath the words, alleged incapacitated adult. I had spent nearly 69 years building a life defined by responsibility, careful decisions, and independence. Now, in a single legal document, I had become someone's allegation. I looked up at Benjamin. Did he really do this? Benjamin nodded quietly. He did. Can he simply file something like this? Anyone with legal standing can file a petition. Winning it is something entirely different. He slid another folder toward me. I've already reviewed everything. Inside were copies of Daniel's filing. Each page hurt more than the one before. Daniel claimed I had become forgetful, that I struggled to remember medications, that I was vulnerable to financial exploitation, that I resisted assistance because I lacked insight into my declining condition. There were even statements saying I had become isolated. I almost laughed. Isolated, I volunteered every week, attended church twice a week, met Grace regularly, spoke with neighbors almost every day. Benjamin watched me carefully. What stands out? He mixed tiny pieces of truth with enormous lies. Exactly. He pointed to one paragraph. Mrs. Underwood prefers to remain at home despite increasing safety concerns. I do prefer to remain at home. But there are no safety concerns. That's why wording matters. He highlighted another sentence. Family has attempted to assist for several months. That's technically true. But it doesn't explain why. I slowly began understanding something. Daniel hadn't invented everything. He had simply rearranged reality. Each sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Together they created an entirely false picture. Benjamin opened another folder. Our response begins today. He had already organized dozens of tabs: medical records, bank records, timeline, witness list, independent evaluation, mail records, character references. Every document was labeled with remarkable precision. I like organized people, he said with a smile. So did my husband. I can tell. He handed me another legal pad. I need names. Names. Everyone who has observed your daily life. I immediately began writing. Grace Whitmore, Olivia Brooks, Dr. Melissa Carter, Dr. Nathan Reynolds, Pastor David Collins, Library Director Susan Keller, Volunteer Coordinator Megan Ellis, my next-door neighbor Harold Jenkins, the pharmacist who had filled my prescriptions for years. Benjamin nodded approvingly. Excellent. We're not trying to prove perfection. We're proving consistency. That afternoon, he began making calls. The first person to arrive was Grace. She walked into Benjamin's office carrying a folder nearly as thick as mine. I brought everything, Benjamin smiled. What exactly is everything? Grace looked almost offended. Charlene has lived across from me for 25 years. I keep Christmas cards, neighborhood newsletters, photos, community volunteer schedules. I even printed text messages. Benjamin laughed softly. I already like you. Grace sat beside me. I figured someone should tell the truth. Benjamin asked her several questions. How often do you see Charlene? Almost daily. Has she ever appeared confused? No. Does she drive safely? Better than half the people in Columbus. Does she manage her own shopping? Every week. Cooking? Every day. Appointments. She reminds me about mine. Benjamin smiled while taking notes. Then he asked something unexpected. Has Daniel ever visited when Charlene wasn't home? Grace thought for a moment. Several times. My head turned. What? She looked at me apologetically. I didn't think much about it then. When, mostly during weekdays, I assumed you'd asked him to check something. Benjamin immediately looked interested. Did you ever see what he was doing? She frowned. Usually he'd walk around the property. Sometimes he'd check the mailbox. Twice I saw him trying the garage door. I felt my stomach tighten. I never asked him to. Benjamin quietly wrote every word. After Grace left, Olivia Brooks arrived from the bank. She brought certified account records, signature comparisons, authorization timelines, internal notes. Benjamin asked her only factual questions. When was Daniel's first inquiry? 8 months ago. Did Mrs. Underwood request those inquiries? No. Did Daniel ask how guardianship affected financial management? Yes. I looked toward Olivia. You remember that? She nodded. I remember because it wasn't an ordinary question. Benjamin continued. Did you approve any ownership changes? No. Why not? We required Mrs. Underwood's direct authorization. And did she provide it? No. Olivia hesitated before adding one final sentence. Mrs. Underwood has always handled her banking personally. She's one of our most organized clients. Benjamin thanked her. When she left, he leaned back in his chair. Every witness tells the same story. The truth usually does. Over the next week, our evidence continued growing. The library director wrote a detailed statement describing my volunteer work. She noted that I managed inventory records, organized community literacy events, and trained new volunteers. If Charlene couldn't organize her own life, Susan wrote, she certainly couldn't organize ours. Pastor Collins submitted another letter. He described my role managing church donation records. I smiled when I read one sentence. Charlene corrects accounting errors the rest of us overlook. Benjamin chuckled. I imagine that's true. It is. Even my pharmacist contributed. He documented that I consistently requested refills on schedule, asked informed questions about medications, and independently managed every prescription. Each letter strengthened our case. But something else happened that I hadn't expected. The more people Benjamin interviewed, the more stories emerged. One afternoon, Harold Jenkins, my retired next-door neighbor, stopped by the office. I think I should mention something. Benjamin invited him to sit. Harold cleared his throat. About 6 months ago, I was trimming my hedges. I saw Daniel carrying boxes out of Charlene's garage. I frowned. Boxes? Harold nodded. I assumed you'd asked him. I didn't. Do you remember what was inside? No. But I remember he loaded them into his truck. Benjamin asked carefully. Did Mrs. Underwood appear to know about it? I never saw her. Again, Benjamin wrote everything down. After Harold left, I felt emotionally exhausted. I don't understand. Benjamin closed his notebook. We may never understand every decision Daniel made, but we don't have to. We only have to establish facts. Late Friday afternoon, Benjamin's assistant walked into the conference room carrying another envelope. It just arrived. Benjamin read the return address. Then he sighed. What's wrong? It's the court scheduling order. He opened the envelope. The hearing has been set. How soon? 3 weeks. Only 3 weeks. Everything suddenly felt very real. Benjamin remained calm. We'll be ready. I know. But there's one thing I still don't understand. What? If Daniel knows about Dr. Reynolds' evaluation. He doesn't. I blinked. He doesn't. No. The report isn't automatically sent to him. He only knows you attended an appointment. I looked out the office window. So he still believes I'm unprepared. Benjamin smiled. I believe he does. For the first time since this began, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not fear, confidence. Because Daniel had built his case believing I would quietly accept it. He still imagined the frightened woman sitting silently in Dr. Carter's office while he answered every question. He had no idea that woman no longer existed. As I gathered my purse to leave, Benjamin walked me to the elevator. Charlene. Yes. There's one more thing. What is it? I've handled elder law cases for 28 years, he smiled warmly. I've rarely seen someone prepare as carefully as you have. I laughed softly. Thomas always said preparation was another form of courage. Benjamin nodded. He was right. The elevator doors opened. As I stepped inside, my phone buzzed. One new message. From Daniel. Mom, I know the court paperwork probably upset you. I hope you'll understand I'm only doing this because I love you. Maybe we can talk before the hearing. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I quietly slipped the phone back into my purse. For months, Daniel had been writing a story about me. Now, for the first time, he was about to discover that I had been writing one too, and unlike his version, mine came with evidence. The Franklin County Probate Court was quieter than I expected. There were no television cameras, no crowded hallways, no dramatic shouting, just polished wooden benches, soft conversations, and people waiting for decisions that would change their lives forever. Benjamin had warned me that real courtrooms were nothing like the movies. They're slower, he'd said, and somehow far more emotional. He was right. As we walked through security that morning, I looked around at the other families. An elderly husband sitting beside his wife holding her hand. Two sisters quietly reviewing paperwork. A young man helping his grandfather into a wheelchair. Each family carried its own story. Mine happened to be sitting 20 feet away. Daniel stood beside Rebecca near the courtroom doors. He wore a navy suit I had bought him for his first job interview nearly 20 years earlier. He looked tired. His shoulders were tense. When our eyes met, he gave me a sad smile. Not triumphant, not angry, almost disappointed. For a brief moment, I saw the little boy who used to run across soccer fields with grass stains on his knees. Then I remembered why we were there. Benjamin gently touched my elbow. You ready? I nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. Inside the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Prescott entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. She was a composed woman with silver hair, calm eyes, and the kind of voice that immediately commanded respect without ever becoming loud. Once everyone was seated, she looked over the case file. In the matter of Charlene Underwood, she glanced toward me. Mrs. Underwood, good morning. Good morning, Your Honor. Then she looked toward Daniel. Mr. Underwood. He nodded respectfully. Judge Prescott spent several minutes reviewing procedural matters before speaking directly to Daniel. You have petitioned this court for guardianship over your mother. Yes, Your Honor. You understand that guardianship removes significant legal rights from another adult. I do. And you believe that action is necessary. I do. His voice sounded steady, confident. For a moment, I wondered if he truly believed everything he had written, or if he had repeated the story so many times that it had become real to him. Judge Prescott nodded. Counsel. Daniel's attorney, a neatly dressed man named Richard Evans, stood. Your Honor, Mr. Underwood has acted solely out of concern for his mother's safety. He spoke calmly, respectfully. There was nothing theatrical about him. He presented Daniel exactly as Benjamin had predicted. A devoted son, a worried caregiver, someone reluctantly asking the court for help. Listening to him, I almost believed it myself. Then he began listing concerns: memory lapses, medication management, financial vulnerability, resistance to assistance, social isolation. Benjamin remained completely silent. He didn't object, he simply took notes. When Richard finished, Judge Prescott turned toward Benjamin. Mr. Lawson. Benjamin stood slowly. Your Honor, we believe the evidence will demonstrate something very different. He paused. Mrs. Underwood is fully capable of managing every aspect of her own life. We further believe that many concerns presented to this court originated from unverified reports rather than objective observations. The judge nodded. Proceed. Benjamin surprised me. Instead of calling a witness immediately, he looked toward me. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like Mrs. Underwood to testify first. Granted. My heart pounded as I walked toward the witness stand. The bailiff administered the oath. I promised to tell the truth. Then I sat down. Benjamin smiled reassuringly. Mrs. Underwood. How old are you? 68. What was your profession? I worked as a public librarian for 34 years. Do you currently live alone? Yes. Do you manage your own household? I do. He continued gently. Who pays your bills? I do. Who schedules your medical appointments? I do. Who prepares your medications? I do. Who drives you to volunteer work? I do. He smiled. When was your last volunteer shift? Last Wednesday. What did you do? I helped organize literacy materials for our children's reading program. What time did it begin? 9 o'clock. What time did you finish? 1:30. He nodded. Then he asked the question I hadn't expected. Mrs. Underwood, what medications do you currently take? Without hesitation, I listed every prescription, dosages, times, purpose. Judge Prescott quietly made a note. Benjamin continued. What is today's date? I answered. What day of the week is it? Answered. Who is the current governor of Ohio? Answered. What did you eat for breakfast? Oatmeal with blueberries and black coffee. He smiled. No further questions. Richard Evans approached. His tone remained polite. Mrs. Underwood, your son loves you, doesn't he? Yes. And he visits regularly. He used to. So it's fair to say he knows your daily life well. He knows parts of it. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Have you ever forgotten where you placed your keys? I smiled faintly. Of course. Have you ever repeated a story? I'm sure I have. Have you ever needed help with household repairs? Certainly. He looked toward the judge. So you do require assistance. Benjamin stood. Objection. Mischaracterizes the testimony. Sustained. Richard tried another approach. Mrs. Underwood, isn't it true that your son has offered assistance repeatedly? Yes. And you've accepted it? Sometimes. So why are we here today? The courtroom became very quiet. I looked directly at Richard. Because offering help isn't the same as proving someone needs to surrender their rights. Even Judge Prescott looked up from her notes. Richard paused. Then he asked one final question. Do you believe your son intended to hurt you? The answer caught everyone by surprise. I honestly don't know. Silence. I believe he convinced himself he was solving one problem. I glanced briefly toward Dan. Without realizing he was creating another. Richard quietly returned to his table. Benjamin called the next witness, Dr. Melissa Carter. She explained our long relationship, my medical history, my annual evaluations. Then Benjamin asked the critical question. Doctor, based on your personal examination, do you currently have any concerns regarding Mrs. Underwood's cognitive capacity? No. Did your opinion change after meeting with her directly? Yes. Why? Because my own observations did not support the concerns that had previously been reported. Benjamin handed her my medical chart. Who reported many of those concerns? Daniel Underwood. Were they independently verified before being documented? No. Would you characterize those entries as medical findings? No. They reflected information reported by family. Benjamin nodded. No further questions. Richard attempted to minimize the issue. So physicians routinely rely upon family observations. Yes. Is that inappropriate? No. Dr. Carter answered honestly. But those observations must eventually be confirmed. Were they confirmed here? No. Quite the opposite. Richard quietly sat down. Next came Dr. Nathan Reynolds. His testimony was concise, professional, powerful. He explained every cognitive assessment, every executive functioning exercise, every financial reasoning test. Finally, Benjamin asked, Doctor, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what is your conclusion? Dr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Charlene Underwood demonstrates full decision-making capacity. She independently manages complex financial, medical, and personal responsibilities. I found no evidence supporting guardianship. The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Prescott looked down at the report in front of her, then back toward Dr. Reynolds. You have no reservations. None. Richard stood for cross-examination. Doctor, could a patient perform well during one examination yet decline later? Certainly. So your evaluation represents only one point in time? Yes. But based upon extensive standardized testing and extensive functional assessment. Richard nodded. No further questions. Then Benjamin called Olivia Brooks. She described Daniel's repeated inquiries regarding account access, joint ownership, power of attorney, emergency contacts. She carefully explained that Daniel had sought information months before filing the petition. Finally, Benjamin asked, "Did Mrs. Underwood ever request those inquiries?" "No." "Has she consistently managed her own banking?" "Yes." "Would you describe her as financially competent?" "Absolutely." Judge Prescott wrote another note. Benjamin looked toward me briefly. His expression remained calm. But I recognized something. Confidence. For the first time that day, the carefully constructed story Daniel had spent months building was beginning to crack. And we still hadn't called Grace, or presented the timeline, or introduced the financial records. The hearing wasn't over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. When court resumed after the afternoon recess, the atmosphere had changed. During the morning session, Daniel's petition had sounded persuasive. He had entered the courtroom appearing to be a devoted son, carrying the difficult burden of protecting his aging mother. By lunchtime, that image had begun to fade. Now everyone waited to see what Benjamin Lawson would reveal next. Judge Eleanor Prescott adjusted her glasses and looked toward Benjamin. "You may continue. Thank you, Your Honor." Benjamin rose calmly. "The defense calls Grace Whitmore." Grace walked confidently to the witness stand. She wasn't a polished public speaker. She wasn't a medical expert. She wasn't an attorney. She was simply my best friend of 25 years. Sometimes the truth needs nothing more than someone who has quietly witnessed it. After taking the oath, she settled into the witness chair. Benjamin smiled warmly. "Mrs. Whitmore, how long have you known Charlene Underwood?" 25 years. "How often do you see her?" "Usually every day." "What kinds of activities do you observe?" Grace smiled. "Everything. We drink coffee. We volunteer together. We attend church. We garden. We walk. Sometimes we argue over crossword puzzles." A few people in the courtroom laughed softly. Even Judge Prescott smiled. Benjamin continued, "Have you ever observed Charlene becoming disoriented in her own neighborhood?" "Never." "Has she ever failed to recognize you?" "No." "Has she ever appeared unable to manage daily life?" "Absolutely not." Benjamin nodded. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you ever observe Daniel Underwood collecting Charlene's mail?" "Yes." "When?" "Several months before all this started." "Did Charlene ask him to do that?" "Not that I know of." "Did you ever discuss it with her?" "Yes." "She was surprised." Benjamin walked to the evidence table and picked up several photographs. "Are these pictures of Charlene participating in community events over the past year?" "They are." He handed them to the judge. One showed me organizing a library fundraiser. Another pictured me helping children during a literacy event. Another captured me balancing donation records after a church fundraiser. Benjamin looked back toward Grace. "Based on everything you've personally observed, do you believe Charlene is incapable of managing her own affairs?" Grace didn't hesitate. "No." Then she looked directly toward Daniel. "I believe she was managing just fine until someone started trying to manage her." The courtroom fell silent. Richard Evans rose for cross-examination. "Mrs. Whitmore, you care deeply about Charlene." "I do." "So naturally you'd want to help her." "Of course." "You aren't a physician." "No." "So you cannot diagnose cognitive decline." Grace smiled politely. "No. But I can recognize common sense." A few quiet chuckles echoed through the courtroom. Richard wisely moved on. No further questions. Benjamin called one final witness. Not another doctor, not another banker. Instead, he called himself to the evidence podium. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Defendant's Exhibit 21. His assistant wheeled in a large display board. At first glance, it looked like an oversized calendar. Colored lines connected documents, dates, phone calls, bank visits, medical notes, business records. The timeline stretched nearly a full year. Judge Prescott leaned forward. So this is your chronology? Yes, Your Honor. Benjamin picked up a pointer. I'd like to begin here. He tapped the first date. 8 months before the guardianship petition. He displayed the official record dissolving Daniel's investment company. This business failure is undisputed. Richard Evans nodded. No objection. Benjamin moved to the next date. Within 2 weeks, he pointed toward another document. Daniel contacts Dr. Carter expressing concern about memory problems. Another step. Within 3 weeks, Daniel asks his mother's bank about joint ownership. Another. He requests information regarding powers of attorney. Another. Emergency contact changes. Another. Mail begins disappearing. Another. Senior care placement inquiry. Another. Independent medical evaluation requested. Another. Guardianship petition filed. He stepped away from the board. Viewed individually, each event may appear innocent. He paused. Viewed together, they demonstrate a carefully escalating pattern. Richard stood immediately. Objection? Counsel is drawing conclusions. Judge Prescott nodded. Sustained. Benjamin inclined his head respectfully. Then I'll allow the documents to speak for themselves. He handed the timeline to the judge. Judge Prescott spent several long minutes reviewing every page. No one spoke. The silence somehow became louder than testimony. Finally, she looked toward Richard Evans. Counsel, do you dispute the chronology? Richard slowly stood. No, Your Honor. The dates appear accurate. Judge Prescott nodded thoughtfully. Benjamin wasn't finished. He approached the witness stand once more. Your Honor, I'd like permission to introduce one final exhibit. Granted. He lifted 2 signatures, one genuine, one from the authorization adding Daniel as an account contact. The enlarged images appeared on courtroom monitors. Even from across the room, the differences were obvious. Benjamin turned toward Olivia Brooks. Mrs. Brooks, are these the signatures you previously reviewed? Yes. Do they appear identical? No. Did the bank rely upon them? Yes. Would the bank have approved ownership changes based solely upon these? No. Richard stood again. We're not alleging forgery. Benjamin nodded. Neither am I. I'm simply demonstrating why documentation matters. Judge Prescott carefully examined both signatures herself. Then she quietly placed them aside. Finally, she looked directly toward Daniel. Mr. Underwood. Daniel stood. The judge's voice remained calm. I have several questions. Yes, Your Honor. When did you first believe your mother could no longer manage her affairs? About 8 months ago. Interesting. She glanced toward the timeline. That appears to coincide with the closure of your investment business. Daniel hesitated. I suppose so. Judge Prescott continued. Were you experiencing financial difficulties during that period? Richard immediately stood. Objection. Relevance. Benjamin responded before the judge could speak. Your honor motive becomes relevant when determining the credibility of a petition. Judge Prescott nodded. Overruled. She looked back at Daniel. You may answer. Daniel swallowed. My business was struggling. Were you behind on your mortgage? Silence. Yes. Did you ask your mother's bank about joint ownership? Yes. Did you inquire about powers of attorney? Yes. Were you aware your mother independently passed a comprehensive cognitive evaluation? Daniel looked stunned. What? Benjamin quietly handed the report to the court. Judge Prescott reviewed it, then handed a copy to Richard. Richard's expression changed immediately. Daniel looked at the report for the first time. Color slowly drained from his face. I didn't know. Judge Prescott leaned forward. Mr. Underwood, if your mother demonstrated full decision-making capacity, why did you continue pursuing guardianship? Daniel looked toward me. For the first time all day, he didn't appear confident. He looked frightened. I thought, his voice cracked. I thought she was hiding how bad things had become. Judge Prescott asked softly. Based on whose observations? He hesitated. My own. Benjamin quietly stood. Your Honor. Permission to ask one final question. Granted. Benjamin faced Daniel. Mr. Underwood, can you identify one financial bill your mother failed to pay? No. One medication she failed to take? No. One doctor's appointment she forgot? No. One verified incident where she became lost? No. One objective medical diagnosis supporting incapacity? Daniel stared at the floor. No. Benjamin waited several seconds, then asked the final question. So today, what evidence remains that your mother cannot manage her own life? The courtroom became completely silent. Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because for the first time since this case had begun, there was no story left, only facts, and every single fact pointed in exactly the opposite direction. Judge Prescott quietly closed the file. I have heard enough. She looked down briefly before raising her eyes. I am prepared to issue my ruling. No one moved. The silence inside the courtroom seemed to stretch far longer than it probably did. Judge Eleanor Prescott rested both hands on the thick case file before her. She looked at Daniel first, then at me, then down once more at the dozens of exhibits spread across her bench. When she finally spoke, every word carried weight. Guardianship is one of the most serious actions a court can take. Her voice was calm, measured, and completely without emotion. It removes fundamental rights from an adult citizen. The law therefore requires clear and convincing evidence that such intervention is necessary. She paused. In this matter, she looked directly at me. That burden has not been met. I felt myself release a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding for weeks. Judge Prescott continued. The independent medical evaluation found Mrs. Underwood fully competent. The testimony of her treating physician supports that conclusion. The testimony of her banker supports her continued financial independence. The testimony of community witnesses consistently demonstrates independent daily functioning. She looked toward Daniel. The court also notes that many concerns presented in the petition originated from subjective reports rather than verified observations. Daniel lowered his eyes. Judge Prescott closed the file. Accordingly, the petition for guardianship is denied. For one heartbeat, the room remained completely silent. Then I heard Benjamin quietly whisper, "We did it." But Judge Prescott wasn't finished. She looked again toward Daniel. Mr. Underwood, I believe you care about your mother. Daniel slowly raised his head. I also believe this case demonstrates how easily concern can become control. Her words filled the courtroom. Older adults deserve protection. They also deserve respect. When competent adults disagree with their children, that disagreement alone is not evidence of incapacity. She turned toward me. Mrs. Underwood, you leave this courtroom today with every legal right fully intact. I nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. She gave me a small, kind smile. I wish you peace. The hearing officially ended. People quietly began gathering papers. The bailiff announced that court was adjourned. Yet none of us moved immediately. Daniel remained seated. Rebecca gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Benjamin leaned toward me. Take your time. I stood slowly. Walking across that courtroom somehow felt different than walking into it. I had entered feeling as though I needed to prove who I was. I was leaving knowing no one else could define me. Outside the courtroom, reporters weren't waiting. Neither were television cameras. Only families, lawyers, ordinary people moving on with ordinary lives. Exactly as justice should be. Benjamin gathered his briefcase. I'll handle the final paperwork. Thank you. He smiled warmly. It was an honor. I hugged him. I couldn't have done this without you. He shook his head. You already did. I simply organized the evidence. As Benjamin walked away, I noticed Daniel standing alone near one of the courthouse windows. Rebecca had stepped outside to take a phone call. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he walked toward me. Mom. His voice sounded completely different. Gone was the confidence he'd carried for months. Gone was the certainty. Only exhaustion remained. I'm sorry. I looked at him carefully. What are you sorry for? His eyes filled with tears. I don't even know where to begin. No. You probably don't. He looked down at the courthouse floor. I kept telling myself I was protecting you. Were you? He closed his eyes. I don't know anymore. That answer hurt more than if he had simply lied, because it sounded honest. I thought, he swallowed hard, if I handled everything, you wouldn't have to worry. I waited. Then he whispered the words I had been expecting for months. My business collapsed. I know. His head snapped upward. You know, Benjamin investigated. He nodded slowly. I lost almost everything. The investment company. The clients. The house was close to foreclosure. I couldn't breathe. For the first time since all this had begun, Daniel wasn't speaking like a petitioner. He was speaking like my son. I kept thinking, if I could somehow stabilize everything, I could fix it. Then everything got worse. The debts, the lawsuits, the mortgage. I was drowning. I quietly asked, so you looked at my house? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. I never wanted to steal from you. He wiped his eyes. I convinced myself that guardianship would only be temporary. I told myself I'd protect everything until things improved. I nodded sadly. And when exactly were you planning to ask me? His shoulders slumped. I don't know. No, you didn't. Because there had never been a plan to ask. There had only been a plan to persuade everyone else that asking wasn't necessary. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I reached into my purse. I removed a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of Dr. Reynolds' report. I handed it to him. He looked confused. What is this? The evaluation. He unfolded it. As he silently read each page, tears slowly rolled down his face. When he reached the conclusion, he covered his mouth with one hand. I really, his voice broke, didn't know. I know. I thought you were hiding things. I thought you wouldn't admit you needed help. I gently shook my head. You never actually asked me. He looked at me helplessly. I was afraid. There it is. The truth. Not greed, not hatred, fear. Fear mixed with pride. Fear mixed with desperation. Fear mixed with terrible decisions. None of it excused what he had done, but it explained how he had reached this point. Rebecca quietly joined us. She had obviously been crying too. I'm sorry too, Charlene. I looked at her. Did you know? She nodded slowly. Not at first. But eventually, I should have stopped him. She wiped her eyes. I kept hoping he'd realize how far this had gone. Instead, she'd remained silent. Sometimes silence causes almost as much damage as the wrong words. Daniel looked directly at me. I'll understand if you never want to see me again. The old Charlene, the frightened woman who had first walked into Dr. Carter's office, might have answered emotionally, but that woman had changed. I don't hate you. His eyes widened. I couldn't. You're my son. But love doesn't erase consequences. He nodded. I know. I can't pretend none of this happened. I know. You'll no longer manage anything related to my finances. I understand. You'll no longer be listed on my medical records. I expected that. You'll have to earn trust. Not request it. He nodded again. I will. Whether he truly meant those words? Only time would answer. Several days later, Benjamin helped me complete new legal documents. We updated every emergency contact, every healthcare directive, every financial authorization. Instead of naming family members, I appointed trusted professionals for key legal responsibilities if I ever truly became unable to act for myself. Benjamin reviewed each document carefully. This protects your independence. It also protects your relationships. I smiled. Thomas would have liked that. I think he would. That evening, I sat alone on my front porch watching the sunset. For the first time in months, my home felt like mine again. Not because a judge had said so, because I had found my own voice again. And this time, no one else would ever be allowed to speak over it. No reporters waited outside my house. No television interviews interrupted breakfast. The mailbox contained nothing more exciting than a grocery store flyer, my electric bill, and a postcard from the botanical gardens. After everything that had happened, I found tremendous comfort in ordinary things. I made coffee, watered my flowers, fed the cardinals that still visited every morning. Life hadn't suddenly become perfect. It had simply become mine again. Around 9 o'clock, I drove to the Columbus Public Library for my regular volunteer shift. As I walked through the front doors, Susan Keller looked up from the circulation desk. There she is. She hurried around the counter and hugged me. We've missed you. I've only been gone a few days, she smiled knowingly. It felt longer. Several volunteers gathered around. No one mentioned the court case immediately. Instead, they talked about new children's books, an upcoming reading event, and a fundraiser planned for the following month. That simple kindness nearly brought tears to my eyes. They weren't treating me like someone who had survived a legal battle. They were treating me like Charlene, exactly who I wanted to be. After shelving books for an hour, Susan approached me. Can we talk? We stepped into her office. She closed the door gently. I heard what happened. I nodded. Benjamin told me only what I needed to know. I'm glad. She hesitated. I've been thinking. Oh, we host community education programs every few months. Estate planning, internet safety, tax preparation. I smiled. They're always helpful. She leaned forward. What would you think about speaking? I laughed softly. I've never considered myself a public speaker. I think people would listen. About what? She looked directly at me. Growing older without giving away your voice. The room became quiet. No attorney could have summarized my experience better. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of nearly 40 older adults inside the library's community room. I wasn't nervous. I was grateful. I began with a simple sentence. My name is Charlene Underwood. A few months ago, someone tried to convince others that I could no longer make decisions for myself. The room became completely silent. I didn't tell them every painful detail. Instead, I shared practical lessons. Always read documents before signing. Keep copies of important records. Maintain relationships outside your immediate family. Choose physicians who listen directly to you. Ask questions. Document conversations. Never feel embarrassed about protecting your independence. When I finished speaking, people lined up afterward. Not to congratulate me, to tell me their own stories. One woman whispered that her nephew constantly pressured her to sell her house. Another admitted she had signed papers she never fully understood. A retired teacher confessed she was afraid to question her own children because she didn't want to appear ungrateful. I realized something heartbreaking. My story wasn't unusual. It was simply one many people never talked about. Over the next several months, invitations kept arriving. Church groups, senior centers, retirement communities. Even Dr. Carter asked whether I'd speak during a community health seminar. Each audience asked different questions, but they all wanted the same reassurance. How do you protect your independence without pushing your family away? I always answered honestly. Healthy boundaries don't destroy loving families. They protect them. One afternoon, nearly 3 months after the hearing, I received an unexpected letter. The return address belonged to Daniel. Not a text message, not an email, a handwritten letter. I sat at the kitchen table before opening it. The first sentence immediately caught my attention. Mom, I'm writing because I finally understand why you stopped answering my phone calls. I continued reading slowly. Daniel explained that he had entered financial counseling. He had sold his luxury SUV. He and Rebecca had downsized into a smaller apartment after voluntarily selling their home before foreclosure proceedings became worse. He had accepted a modest position with another financial firm, not as an executive, not as a partner, simply as an employee rebuilding his career. Near the end of the letter, he wrote something that made me stop reading for several minutes. I spent months trying to prove you couldn't manage your life. Therapy helped me realize I couldn't manage my own. Tears quietly rolled down my face. Not because everything was suddenly forgiven, but because responsibility had finally replaced excuses. A week later, Rebecca called. Charlene. Hello, Rebecca. I wanted to ask you something. What is it? Would you be willing to meet us? I thought carefully before answering. Yes. But not to discuss legal documents. No. Just lunch. We met at a small cafe overlooking the Scioto River. The conversation felt awkward at first. None of us knew where to begin. Finally, Daniel spoke. I brought something. He slid a folder across the table. What is it? My financial recovery plan. I looked confused. Why are you showing me this? Because for the first time, I'm not asking you to rescue me. I'm showing you that I'm rescuing myself. Inside were budgets, debt repayment schedules, counseling appointments, monthly goals, everything organized. I smiled despite myself. You've become quite methodical. He laughed quietly. I guess I inherited that from you. For the first time in many months. We both laughed together. It didn't erase the past, but it reminded me that healing rarely arrives all at once. It comes conversation by conversation, choice by choice, month by month. As Christmas approached, Daniel asked if he could help decorate my house. I thought carefully before answering. Yes. But we're doing it together. Deal. We spent an entire Saturday untangling lights, hanging ornaments, and arguing playfully about where Thomas's favorite wooden angel belonged on the tree. Some traditions survive even difficult years. That evening after Daniel and Rebecca left, I stood in the living room looking at the finished tree. Thomas's photograph still rested on the mantel. I smiled toward it. You always believed people deserved second chances. I finally understand why. Not everyone changes. Some never do. But genuine accountability deserves room to grow. As the months passed, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't thought possible. I returned to volunteering, continued speaking throughout Central Ohio, helped older adults understand financial exploitation, healthcare advocacy, and legal planning. Dr. Carter eventually invited me to help review educational materials for patients and families discussing healthy caregiving. Benjamin occasionally called just to ask how I was doing. Grace still beat me at crossword puzzles more often than I cared to admit. Some things never change. One spring afternoon, I received a handwritten note from an 82-year-old woman who had attended one of my talks. She wrote, "Because of your story, I finally asked questions before signing papers my grandson brought me. They weren't what he said they were. Thank you for reminding me that growing older doesn't mean becoming invisible." I folded that letter carefully and placed it inside the same drawer where Thomas had once kept our family photographs. Of all the documents I'd collected during the hardest season of my life, that one became my favorite because it reminded me that surviving hardship is meaningful. But using that experience to protect someone else, that's where healing truly begins. Nearly a year after the court hearing, I found myself sitting in the same examination room where this story had truly begun. The walls hadn't changed. The watercolor painting of the farmhouse still hung behind Dr. Melissa Carter's desk. The chairs were in the same places. Even the clock on the wall ticked with the same quiet rhythm. But I was not the same woman who had walked through that door 12 months earlier. Back then I had entered believing I was attending an ordinary annual checkup. Instead, I discovered someone else had been trying to rewrite my life. Today I carried nothing except my purse, my appointment notebook, and a quiet confidence that no one could take away. Emily, the receptionist, smiled when I checked in. "Good morning, Mrs. Underwood." "Good morning. I don't think you need these anymore." She laughed as she handed me the familiar clipboard. "I know you'll probably point out if we miss anything. I've developed a reputation. The best kind." A few minutes later, the nurse called my name. "Charlene Underwood." I stood. No one stood beside me. No one answered for me. No one reached for my paperwork. I walked into the examination room alone, exactly as I preferred. After checking my blood pressure, the nurse smiled. 121/72. Excellent. Still walking every morning? Every day. She entered everything into the computer before leaving. Moments later, Dr. Carter stepped inside. She smiled warmly. "It's good to see you." "It's good to see you too." She sat down across from me instead of immediately opening my chart. "Before we begin, I've wanted to tell you something." I looked at her. "Last year changed the way I practice medicine." I was surprised. "How so?" She folded her hands. "I still value information from family members. But now I make sure my patients always have the opportunity to speak for themselves first." She smiled gently. "You taught me that." I shook my head. "I think we taught each other." She laughed softly. "I think you're right." Then we began the examination. The same questions, the same routine. Only this time every answer felt symbolic. "What medications are you taking?" I answered. "Any recent falls?" "No." "Managing your appointments?" "Yes." "Any concerns about memory?" I smiled. "My memory reminds me to bring this notebook." She laughed. I expected that answer. At the end of the visit, she closed my chart. "You continue to be in excellent health." "Thank you." As I stood to leave, she asked one final question. "Still giving community talks?" "Almost every month." "Keep doing it." "I plan to." Walking out of the clinic, I paused for a moment in the parking lot. 1 year earlier, I'd walked out of that same building questioning everything. Today I walked away reminded that my voice had never truly disappeared. It had simply needed room to be heard. Life continued moving forward. Daniel continued attending counseling. He kept every promise he had made after the court case. Slowly, patiently. He rebuilt his finances. He rebuilt his marriage. Most importantly, he rebuilt trust. Not through apologies, through consistency. Sometimes he called simply to ask how my garden was growing. Sometimes we met for lunch. Sometimes weeks passed without either of us calling. Healthy relationships don't require constant reassurance. They require mutual respect. Rebecca changed too. She eventually volunteered with a nonprofit organization that educated caregivers about ethical decision-making for aging family members. One afternoon, she confessed something to me. "I kept thinking staying quiet was keeping peace." I nodded. "A lot of people believe that." It wasn't. No, it wasn't. Grace remained exactly who she'd always been. Blunt, loyal, completely incapable of letting me win at crossword puzzles. Some friendships become even stronger after surviving difficult seasons. Ours certainly did. Benjamin Lawson eventually retired. Before leaving his practice, he invited me to speak during a seminar for new elder law attorneys. Standing before that room full of young lawyers, I said something I hoped they would never forget. The law protects documents. But never forget that behind every document is a human being whose dignity deserves equal protection. Benjamin later told me several students quoted that sentence during their graduation ceremony. Thomas would have enjoyed hearing that. Speaking of Thomas, people often ask whether I still talk to him. The answer is yes. Not because I believe he answers, but because after 39 years of marriage, some conversations simply become part of who you are. Every Sunday evening, while balancing my checkbook at the same kitchen table where we once planned our future together, I still glance toward his photograph. Sometimes I smile. Sometimes I complain about the weeds in the garden. Sometimes I simply say, "We're doing all right." And somehow, that always feels enough. Looking back now, people often assume the biggest victory in my story happened inside the courtroom. They're wrong. The courtroom simply confirmed something I should never have forgotten. The greatest victory happened much earlier. It happened the moment I answered my doctor's questions myself. Not because I remembered every medication, not because I knew every appointment, not even because I proved my memory. It happened because I refused to let someone else's opinion become my identity. Growing older changes many things. Our hair turns gray. Our knees complain. Reading glasses become permanent companions. But age should never automatically erase wisdom. It should never silence experience. And it should never allow anyone else to decide who we are before we've had the chance to speak. Today, my journals fill an entire bookshelf in my home office. Some people might call that excessive. I call it gratitude. Each notebook reminds me that ordinary days matter. Small details matter. Truth matters. Not because we're preparing for court, but because every ordinary day is proof that our lives belong to us. If my story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this: accept help when it is offered with respect. Offer help without expecting control. Protect your independence without becoming isolated. And if someone ever tries to speak for you before you've spoken for yourself, answer the question clearly, calmly, confidently, because your voice is one of the few things no one should ever be allowed to take away. Thank you for walking this journey with me. I hope you never need this story, but if you ever do, I hope you'll remember that the truth supported by courage and preparation is stronger than fear, much stronger.